My father died on a Tuesday in March, and by Thursday my stepmother had already changed the locks on the house. I found out the way you find out about things you were never supposed to know. I drove the 2 hours from my apartment in the city with a casserole dish my neighbor had pressed into my hands and a bag I'd packed for a week, because that's what you do when a parent dies. You go home. You help with arrangements. You sit in the same rooms where the grief is and you let it be heavy because that's the only honest thing to do with it. I pulled into the driveway on Crestwood Lane and my key did not turn the lock. I stood on the porch I had grown up on with a ceramic dish of pasta getting cold in my hands, and I tried the key 3 times because the first time I thought I'd made a mistake. I had not made a mistake. My stepmother, Renata, opened the door from the inside. She was dressed, composed, her hair done the way it was always done, not a woman in the middle of grief but a woman who had already moved past a particular phase of it. She looked at me with the particular patience of someone who had been expecting this and had prepared. "We've had the locks changed for security," she said. "There have been some people in and out for the arrangements." I stood on the porch with the casserole. She did not invite me in. My father had been married to Renata for 9 years. He had been a widower for 6 years before that, when my mother died from a cancer that moved faster than anyone expected. I was 17 when my mother died and 23 when my father remarried. I had not been at the wedding. That is its own story, and not one I am going to tell today. But the short version is that Renata arrived in my father's life quickly and arranged herself within it with the efficiency of someone who understood that the window was narrow and the competition was a grief-hollowed man who had forgotten how to say no. His name was Vayle. He built boats for 30 years. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. My father built wooden boats in the old style, the kind that took months and required a patience that most people have traded away for something faster. He had a shop, a chandlery on the water on the edge of a town called Morro Bay, that he had run since before I was born. The word chandlery is old. It once meant a place that sold candles, and then over centuries it came to mean a shop that supplied ships, everything a working vessel needs, rigging and hardware and rope and paint and the kind of knowledge that comes from being close to the water your entire life. My father's chandlery had been in our family for 2 generations. His father had opened it after the war with a lease and a truck and a belief that the coast would always need people who understood what they were selling. My father had inherited it at 31 when his father's heart gave out on a February morning in the shop itself, and he had run it for every year since. The chandlery was the kind of place that the internet was supposed to kill and somehow hadn't, because the people who needed what my father sold were not the kind of people who bought things from a screen. They were sailors and restorers and old men with more knowledge than money who came in to talk as much as to buy. My father knew every one of them by name. He kept a logbook behind the counter where he wrote down what people were working on, what they needed, when they might be back. The logbook went back 20 years when I was last in the shop. Columns of names and dates and notes in his block handwriting. Peterson 16-foot catboat, needs bronze gudgeons. Check Wilcox Crittenden catalog. Hammond full restoration, inquire retique availability, October window. He kept it the way a doctor keeps patient notes, not for billing but because he believed that a person who came to him with a problem deserved to have someone remember them. The building itself sat at the end of a short dock road on the bay side of Morro Bay. A weathered cedar shingle structure with a sign that had been repainted 4 times in my lifetime and always the same color. A dark green that my grandfather had chosen and my father had never seen any reason to change. Inside it smelled of rope and paint and machine oil and the particular dry smell of brass hardware stored in wooden bins. A smell I could not encounter anywhere in the world without thinking of my father, and the way the afternoon light came through the west-facing windows in winter, and made even the most ordinary inventory look like it was worth something. I grew up in that shop. I learned to sand in that shop. I learned the names of every type of wood joinery and every grade of marine varnish, and how to read the grain of teak before you committed a chisel to it. My father taught me those things not because he needed the help but because he believed that the way you learned what mattered was by working alongside someone who already knew it. He was a patient teacher. He never raised his voice. He showed things once slowly and then he let you try, and if you made a mistake he showed you again. When I left for college I took all of that with me, the patience and the precision and the knowledge that good work is slow work and slow work is the only kind that holds. I studied architecture because it was the closest formal discipline to what my father did, the marriage of structure and material in the long view. I graduated, worked for a firm in the city for 4 years, and then struck out on my own doing restoration work, old buildings, the kind that other architects didn't want because the bones were complicated and the clients were particular. I was good at it. The practice was small and I kept it small on purpose. My father and I talked on the phone every Sunday. That was our arrangement, had been since college. 12 years of Sunday calls every week, no exceptions unless one of us was traveling somewhere without signal. In those calls he told me about the shop and I told him about whatever building I was working on, and we talked about wood and grain and the patience required by old things. We did not talk much about Renata. I want to be clear about something because it matters to what came later. I did not dislike Renata because she had married my father. A man has the right to rebuild his life after loss, and my father had been genuinely lonely in the years after my mother died. I had seen the loneliness in those early Sunday calls before Renata, when the house on Crestwood Lane was too quiet and my father rattled around in it like a coin in an empty can. If she had made him happy, genuinely happy, I would have found a way to be glad for him. But there were things I noticed in the Sunday calls that I did not investigate because investigation felt like disloyalty to a man I loved and trusted. Little inconsistencies. The shop hours that changed. The supplier relationships that shifted. The way certain topics, the Chandlery finances, the building lease, the direction of the business, began to carry a particular silence in his voice when I brushed near them. The silence of a man who has made a decision and is not sure yet how to explain it. I told myself it was his business. I told myself he was capable of managing his own affairs. I told myself the distance was temporary and that I would visit more and that eventually I would understand what was happening. I did not visit more. That was the first mistake. She had told me on the porch that the Chandlery was not part of the estate. She said it clearly and without hesitation, the way you say things you have rehearsed. Your father decided some time ago that the business was not viable and closed it down. The building has been sold. The contents were already liquidated. I'm sorry if you had an attachment to it. He wanted to tell you himself, but he ran out of time. I stood there with the cold casserole. He ran out of time. My father had been sick for 14 months. 14 months of Sundays in which he had called me without fail, in which his voice had been slower and quieter as the months moved, but in which he had never once mentioned closing the Chandlery. He had talked about it 2 Sundays before he died. He had told me about a man who came in looking for a particular type of brass cleating hardware that my father had found for him in a catalog from a supplier in Nova Scotia. He had told me about the weather and the bay and the way the light came off the water in March. He had not mentioned selling the building. He had not mentioned closing the shop. I did not say any of this to Renata. I took the casserole home to my apartment and I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about the 14 months of Sunday calls and what was in them and what was not. And then I thought about my father, the way you think about someone you have lost when the shock is still fresh and the grief is still organizing itself into something you can carry. He was a careful man. He was patient and deliberate, and he did not make decisions quickly. He kept records of everything. The logbook in the shop. The maintenance logs for the building. The notebooks he kept about ongoing projects. He documented the way an architect documents, not because anyone required it but because he believed that the record of how you made a decision was as important as the decision itself. A man like that does not close a business his family built without telling his daughter. I called the estate attorney 3 days later, after the funeral, after the house on Crestwood Lane had filled and emptied of the people who came to stand in the same rooms as the grief and then go back to their own lives. The attorney's name was Warren Pelham, an older man who had handled my father's affairs for 15 years, and who had the particular apologetic manner of someone delivering news he does not enjoy. He told me that the estate consisted of the house on Crestwood Lane, the contents of the house, and certain financial accounts. The Chandlery building had been sold 18 months ago. The business had been wound down. The proceeds had gone into the estate and were now passing to Renata as the surviving spouse. My father had left me what Pelham described as certain personal property, a category which he read from a list. Some tools from the house. His collection of naval architecture books. A small chest of his father's things. And the Chandlery contents, I said. Pelham looked down at the document. He paused for a moment in the way of a man choosing his words. The Chandlery contents were listed separately, he said, as personal property. The building itself was sold. But the contents, the inventory, the tools, the equipment were left to you. They are currently in storage. Where in storage? He told me the name of a storage facility on Route 9, about 12 miles from the bay. Renata, who had said nothing during this reading, said with the same patient composure she always carried, that she had arranged for the contents to be moved there when the building sold. She said it was a practical decision, that the inventory had no significant value, mostly old stock and outdated equipment, and that she had thought I might want to go through it at some point and keep what was sentimental. Outdated equipment. Old stock. That is what she said about the Chandlery my father had spent 30 years building. I drove to the storage facility on Route 9 2 days later. It was a standard climate-controlled unit, 12 by 20, with a roll door and a padlock whose combination Pelham had given me on a slip of paper. I turned the combination and opened the door and stood in the entrance for a long time. It was not outdated equipment. It was my father's life's work, boxed and stacked and arranged with a care that told me he had packed it himself, or supervised its packing, because the boxes were labeled in his handwriting with the same block letters he used in his logbooks. Marine hardware, vintage, brass. Varnish and solvents, current stock. Patterns and templates, hull designs. Each box was sealed with the particular neatness of a man who expects someone else to open them eventually, and wants to make it easy for that person. He had thought about me standing in this doorway. He had packed for me. Along the back wall, covered in moving blankets, something large. Several somethings. I walked in and touched the nearest one. The blanket was thick movers padding, the kind rental companies charge extra for. Not a bedsheet pulled from a closet. He had cared enough about what was under it to wrap it properly. I pulled back the corner first, the way you check a wound before you commit to looking at it fully, and then I pulled the whole blanket back in one motion. I sat down on a stack of boxes and put my hands on my knees and breathed. Under the blanket was a half-finished wooden boat hull, approximately 16 feet, lapstrake construction, white oak ribs, cedar planking. The kind of work that takes a craftsman months even when they are not sick. The kind of work that requires full attention and steady hands. My father had a tremor in his right hand in the last 2 years. I knew this from the Sunday calls. He had mentioned it the way he mentioned weather as a condition to be worked around. The tremor had been getting worse. The hull in front of me showed no tremor. The planking was even, the fastenings flush, the bevels clean. This was the work of a man at the height of his craft, not a man whose hands were failing. I pulled back the second blanket. A set of molds, the kind used to establish the shape of a hull during construction, each one numbered and labeled, each one a different cross-section of the finished form. These were not for the boat in front of me. These were for a different design, larger, a cruising hull, deep-keeled, the type you build when you intend to go somewhere. The third blanket covered a wooden chest. Not the small chest of his father's things that Pelham had mentioned. A sea chest, the old kind, dovetailed corners, brass hardware, a proper lock. My father's initials were burned into the lid. Divi. I did not have the key to that lock. I sat in that storage unit for 2 hours before I drove home. I sat with the smell of cedar and varnish and the particular dry smell of old brass fittings. The smell I had grown up with. The smell that meant my father was nearby and working. And I thought about what Renata had said. No significant value. Old stock. Outdated equipment. She did not know what was in these blankets. She had arranged the move or overseen it, and she had believed it was nothing, because she had never learned to read what my father made. She had lived 9 years with a man who built beautiful things and she had not learned to see them. That was the first thing I understood. The second thing I understood was that I needed to know what I was actually holding before I said anything to anyone. My father had a reputation in that world. He had built maybe 60 boats in his career, all of them documented, most of them still sailing. I knew some names from growing up in the shop, the restorers and the sailors and the collectors who had been clients and had become something closer to colleagues over the years. When you work at a high level in a small world, you accumulate people who understand what you do, and those people are worth more than any equipment in a storage unit. I called Orrin Hughes first because his name appeared more than any other in the logbook sections I had photographed from the chest. 20 years of transactions and correspondence, More than a business relationship, the record of a friendship conducted through the exchange of knowledge and materials and mutual respect. I told him my father had died. He already knew. Word travels in small worlds. He expressed his condolences with the plainness of a man who respects grief enough not to decorate it. He said Gerald Vayle was the finest craftsman he had personally known and that the coast was poorer for his absence, and then he stopped, because he understood as I did that the most respectful thing you can do for a loss that large is not try to measure it. Then I told him about the storage unit. The hull, the molds, the chest. He was quiet for a moment. Describe the hull, he said. I described it. The construction method, the dimensions, the species, the quality of the work. When did he start it, do you think? I said I didn't know. I said from the condition it could have been ongoing for a year or two. Another silence. Your father had a commission, Hughes said. A standing order from a buyer I know. A man named Carver out of Newport. He's been waiting on a 16-foot lapstrake tender for 2 years. Your father took the commission before he got sick, and he never told anyone he was having trouble finishing it. He just kept working. What's the commission worth? Hughes told me. I did not speak for a moment. A 16-foot lapstrake tender built by Gerald Vayle, in the condition I had described, fully finished, was worth considerably more than the storage unit it was sitting in. More than the contents of most storage units. More than Renata's description of outdated equipment had come anywhere close to suggesting. And the molds, I said. The molds are probably for the cruiser he was designing, Hughes said. He told me about it 2 years ago. He'd been working on the design for a decade, on and off. Said he was finally going to build the one he'd always wanted to build. He was going to call it after your mother. I set the phone down on the table and looked at it for a long time. My father, in the last 2 years of his life, sick, his hands unreliable, had been finishing a commissioned boat and designing the boat he had always wanted to build. He had packed his life's work into a storage unit in boxes labeled in his own handwriting, and he had arranged for me to have it. He had said nothing to Renata about what was there. He had let her describe it as old stock while he was still alive to hear her say it. He had known who she was. He had known for longer than I had. I did not call Renata. I did not call Pelham. I drove back to the storage unit the following morning with a notebook and a camera, and I spent 4 hours documenting everything in it. Every box, every label, every piece of hardware, and every pattern and every sheet of the naval architectural drawings I found rolled in a cardboard tube at the back. I photographed the hull from every angle. I photographed the molds and their numbering system. I photographed the sea chest and its brass hardware and the initials burned into the lid. Then I called a man named Declan Foss. Foss was a marine surveyor and appraiser who had been working the coast for 30 years. My father had mentioned him in Sunday calls over the years, had used him for insurance assessments on builds he was completing for clients. He was known for 2 things: accuracy and honesty. He did not inflate values to please sellers, and he did not deflate them to please buyers. He called what he saw. I introduced myself. He knew my father's name immediately, the way Hughes had, the small world recognizing itself. I need an appraisal, I said, of a collection. My father's work. I need to know what it's actually worth, not what someone who doesn't understand it would assume. There was a pause. When did Gerald pass, he said. 8 days ago. Another pause, brief, the kind that holds something real. Send me the photographs first, he said. Then we'll talk. I sent him the photographs that evening, and he called me the next morning at 7:30, which told me something about what he had seen in them. He said several things in that call carefully and in order, the way a man gives a report when the report matters. He confirmed that the lapstrake hull was consistent with Gerald Vayle's known work. He said the quality was, in his professional assessment, among the finest he had seen from my father's shop. He said the Carver commission, which he knew of through his network, had been quoted at a figure that matched what Hughes had told me. He said the hull was probably 90% complete, and that finishing it would require perhaps 2 weeks of skilled work. Then he talked about the molds. The design they correspond to, he said, is one your father had been developing for a long time. I saw the early drawings once, maybe 4 years ago. The full-size molds mean he had moved past design and into production. He was building the cruiser. Or starting to. What would the cruiser be worth finished? He gave me a range. The lower end of the range was the kind of number that changes the shape of the next several years. The upper end was something else. And then there's the chest, I said. He went quiet for a moment. Have you opened it? I don't have the key. He said he thought he might know what was in it, or at least a part of it. He said my father had mentioned once years back that he kept certain things in a locked chest, papers mostly, records of commissions and provenance documentation for materials he had sourced over the years. For builds at the level my father worked, provenance documentation, meaning the records of where the timber came from and how it had been prepared and stored, was not a small thing. It was part of what a buyer was paying for. It established the story of the work. A chest full of that documentation in good condition was not a chest of sentimental items. It was part of the value. I sat with all of this for 2 days before I understood what I needed to do. My father had left me the Chandlery contents knowing what was in them. He had left me the appraisal to discover. He had left me the commission to complete. He had left me the molds and the design and the unfinished cruiser he had begun in the last years of his life. He had arranged the storage and the padlock in the labeled boxes, and he had trusted that I would come and open the door and understand what I was looking at. He had also, I suspected, left me a key somewhere. The call to Declan Foss happened before I found the key, and I want to tell you about that call because it was the moment I understood the full weight of what was in the storage unit. Foss was a marine surveyor and appraiser who had been working the coast for 30 years. My father had mentioned him in Sunday calls over the years, had used him for insurance assessments on builds he was completing for clients. He was known for 2 things: accuracy and honesty. He did not inflate values to please sellers, and he did not deflate them to please buyers. He told you what he saw and he stood behind it. I sent him the photographs at 7 in the evening, and he called me the next morning at 7:30. 12 hours and 30 minutes from photographs to phone call. The speed of that response told me something about what he had seen in the images before I said a word. He said several things in that call carefully and in order, the way a man gives a report when the report matters. He confirmed that the lapstrake hull was consistent with Gerald Vayle's known work. He said the construction method and the quality of the fastenings and the precision of the bevel work were unmistakably my father's. He said the Carver commission, which he knew of through his own professional network, had been quoted at a figure that matched what Hughes had told me. He said the hull was probably 90% complete and that finishing it would require perhaps 2 weeks of skilled work, possibly less depending on the condition of the hardware that still needed fitting. He spoke carefully, with the habit of a man who says a number only once and means it. Then he asked about the molds. What he said next was the thing I had not expected, though I should have. The design they correspond to, he said, is one your father had been developing for a long time. I saw the early drawings once for years ago, when he showed them to me at a survey I was doing for another client at the yard. He had a roll of plans under his arm. He said it was something he was working on for himself, not a commission, just a thing he'd been thinking about for years. I remember thinking the lines were unusual, not typical for his period, more contemporary in the hull form. He'd been paying attention to what the offshore racing community was doing with volume and stability, and he'd incorporated some of that thinking into a traditional design. It was not a common combination. A boat built to those lines in the materials your father worked with, built to the standard of the tender in those photographs. He paused and I heard him choosing words. There's no established market for something like that because nothing like it has come to market. Your father's existing work sells in the range I mentioned. The cruiser, finished, built to his documented standard, would likely set a new reference point for his work. I'm not going to put a number on it until I see the molds and the materials in person. But I'm telling you it would not be an ordinary number. Not an ordinary number. I wrote those words in the notebook I had been keeping since the storage unit and I circled them. He said he could come for the formal appraisal the following week. He said to let him know when I was available and he would arrange his schedule around it. He said he wanted to see the sea chest as well if it was accessible. I don't have the key yet, I said. He was quiet for a moment. When you find it, he said, and the way he said it told me he shared my conviction that the key existed and that I would find it. When you find it, take note of everything in the chest before you move anything. The organization of the contents is part of the documentation. Your father was the kind of man who left things in a specific order for a reason. I thanked him and sat for a while with the phone in my hand. My father had built 60 boats and never become famous in any world except the small one that mattered. He had run a chandlery on a bay in a town most people drove past without stopping. He had lived a life that looked from the outside modest. And he had left behind documentation of enough value to change the shape of the years ahead of me, not because he had been wealthy, but because he had been attentive. He had paid attention to material and to craft and to the people who shared those values, and he had trusted that attention to outlast him. In the small chest of his father's things that Pelham had passed directly to me, the one that had been handed over at the estate reading in a bag with his name on it, I had not yet looked carefully. I had taken it home the day of the reading and set it on my table, and not opened it because the grief was too close and I did not want to go through a dead man's things while my hands were shaking. I opened it on a Saturday morning with coffee, and the windows open to the early spring air. My grandfather's things were modest. A pocket watch that no longer ran, the mechanism stopped at what looked like 3 in the afternoon, a time that meant nothing I could identify. A photograph of a boat at a dock, a man standing beside it who had my father's posture and my own jawline. His eyes squinted against a sun I couldn't see in the frame. A folded letter in handwriting too faded to read clearly. A single page, the ink gone sepia at the folds. A ship's compass, small, tarnished, the needle still finding north with the patience of a thing that has been doing one job its whole life and sees no reason to stop. And at the bottom, under a folded square of cloth that had once been a shop rag, a key. Not an old key. Not an antique. A new key recently cut, the bright silver of hardware store brass not yet dulled by handling. On the cloth beneath it, in my father's block letters, a single sentence. The chest is for you. What's inside will explain the rest. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. I drove to the storage unit that same morning. I did not call anyone first. I went alone, the way you do things that feel important enough to witness yourself before you share them with anyone else. The sea chest opened on the second try, the key catching in the lock and then releasing cleanly, the hinges moving without protest the way things move when they have been made properly. Inside, the smell of cedar and something older, paper and wood oil, the smell of a life spent working. The contents were organized the way my father organized everything. Labeled, ordered. Each section separated by a sheet of cardstock with the date range written on it. The first section was commission records. Every boat my father had built or restored in the last 30 years, documented in order. Client names, deposit amounts, material costs, completion dates, delivery notes. Not the kind of record a man keeps for taxes. The kind of record a man keeps because he believes that the history of what he made matters. The Carver commission was in there. Signed contract, deposit receipt, correspondence, design specifications. Everything a buyer would need to confirm the provenance and value of the work. Everything an appraiser would need to establish fair market value with certainty. The second section was material documentation. The timber sourcing records for every significant build. Where the white oak had come from. Who had cut it and when. How it had been stored. The same for the cedar and the teak and the mahogany. These were not just records. They were the biography of the wood, and for work at this level that biography was part of the price. The third section was thinner, more recent. It was a single folder, and on the tab my father had written one word. Cruiser. Inside was the full design development record for the boat he had been building before he died. Years of it. Sketches and calculations and half models and revised lines, drawings and correspondence with a naval architect in Scotland he had been consulting with for the final proportions. And at the back a typed summary, 2 pages in my father's voice. He had written it for me. He had written it knowing he was not going to finish the boat himself. I stood in the storage unit in the March cold reading 2 pages in my father's voice, and by the time I reached the end I was sitting on the hull of the lapstrake tender with the folder on my knees, and the sea chest open beside me and something in my chest that was not quite grief and not quite relief but lived somewhere in between them, in the territory where love and loss become indistinguishable. The voice in those pages was the Sunday voice. The voice I had grown up with and carried forward through 12 years of calls, patient and specific and attentive to detail. He wrote about the hull's shear line the way he used to talk about it on the phone, as a thing he had considered from every angle and settled on after years of thinking. He wrote about the white oak ribstock he had sourced from a yard in Maine, timber that had been air-drying for 3 years before he touched it with a tool, because you do not rush wood and you do not rush the things you build from it. He wrote about my mother. He wrote that the cruiser had been taking shape in his mind for 20 years since before my mother got sick, that they had talked about it once on a Sunday afternoon when I was in high school and she had said if you ever build it you have to take me somewhere worth going. He had been building the design around that conversation for 2 decades without telling anyone. He had given the boat a name in the folder, written in quotation marks in his neat block letters. She was called Eileen, which was my mother's name. I had to stop reading for a few minutes. When I started again I found the practical section, which was where my father lived most comfortably, the world of things that could be done and in what order. He had written it for me the way he taught me things in the shop, methodically, without condescension, one step at a time and trusting me to follow. He had written about Sybil Crane. He had also included something I had not expected. A name and a phone number, written on a separate slip of paper, with a note below it. The note said, Sybil Crane, attorney, handled certain arrangements separately from the estate. She is expecting your call when you are ready. She has the ownership documentation for the Chandlery contents and the commission records. I had her prepare it 18 months ago when the building sold. I needed to be sure what was yours was actually yours. I looked at the slip of paper for a long time. 18 months ago. Before he died. While Renata thought the storage unit was just old stock. My father had hired a separate attorney and established legal documentation of my ownership of the Chandlery contents, including the commission, including the chest, including the molds and the design and the unfinished cruiser he had started in a building he no longer owned because a woman who did not understand what wood could do had arranged its sale. He had done this while he was still well enough to drive himself to an appointment and sit across from someone and say what he wanted clearly. He had needed me to find the key before he could be sure I would understand what it opened. I put the slip of paper in my jacket pocket. I put the folder back in the chest. I closed the chest and set the key on top of it, and I stood in that storage unit with the smell of cedar around me, and the light coming in through the roll door, and I understood that what Renata had handed me when she changed the locks was not an ending. It was the beginning of what my father had planned. I called Sybil Crane from the parking lot, sitting in my car with the engine off and the spring light flat on the windshield. She answered on the second ring and said my name before I said it, which told me she had been expecting the call. Your father described you exactly, she said. She had a voice that was warm and direct, a woman who did not have time for decoration but was not cold. He said you would take a while to find the key, and then once you found it you would understand everything quickly. How long did he say it would take me? She paused. A brief pause, the kind that contains amusement. He said it might take a week. He said you were methodical. He said you never moved fast when a thing mattered. He was right on both counts. She told me she had prepared documentation 18 months prior when the Chandlery building transferred. That documentation established my clear legal ownership of the Chandlery contents, transferred by my father as a separate act from the estate. Not through the will. A direct transfer, recorded, complete, predating his death by 1.5 years. The will referenced the contents in the estate paperwork as personal property left to me. But the legal ownership was established separately and earlier, the way you build a foundation before you put up walls. The foundation was already there. It had been there the whole time. The will referenced the contents in the estate paperwork, she said, as personal property left to you. But the legal ownership was established separately and earlier. It's the same structure your father used when he first transferred certain equipment from his business accounts to personal property. He was careful about these things. He was careful about everything, I said. He was, she said. He came to me 4 times. Each time he thought of something else to make sure was correct. He was the kind of client who asks the right questions and listens to the answers. He mentioned you in every meeting. Not in a dramatic way. Just in the way people mention the person they are doing something for. The way the work has a face attached to it. I had to breathe slowly for a moment. I looked at the storage unit door from the parking lot. The roll door was closed now, the padlock re-engaged. Everything inside exactly as it had been when I arrived. The March sky had gone gray while I was inside. The kind of gray that could mean rain or could mean nothing, the sky withholding its intentions. What does Renata know? I said. Sybil was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of someone choosing precision over speed. She knows the contents were left to you, she said. That was in the will that Pelham read. What she may not know is the documentation I prepared. The direct transfer. The ownership records. The commission documentation. She may not know that the chest existed or what was in it. Your father handled this at my office, separately from all his other arrangements. Pelham's office had no involvement. Renata's name does not appear in any of my files. She called it outdated equipment, I said. Yes, Sybil said. People often don't know the value of what they're dismissing. She paused. That's usually their problem. When it's also been documented and transferred legally, it stops being a problem for you. The commission, I said. The Carver commission. I need to understand whether I can complete it and deliver it, or whether there's a legal complication because the building where it was started is now sold. There is no complication, Sybil said. The commission was made to your father personally, not to the business entity associated with the building. The contract is in the chest. The work belongs to you to complete or assign. The buyer has been waiting and is still interested. I made a note of that in the file. You spoke to the buyer. Your father asked me to. About 6 months ago. He wanted someone to hold the thread in case it was needed. He said he did not want the commission to go cold while the estate was being settled. He thought you might need time before you were ready to work and he wanted to make sure the buyer understood that. I sat with that for a moment. He had thought of this too. He had thought of the buyer and the thread and the fact that someone needed to hold it while he was still able to ask someone to hold it. He had been a man with a tremor in his right hand and a body that was failing him, and he had spent the time he had left not on the house or the accounts or any of the things that people typically spend their final arrangements on, but on making sure that the work, his work, my inheritance, the thing that was mine, was protected, documented, held in place for me to find. What's your advice? I said. About next steps. She was practical and clear, the way you want someone to be when the situation has been complicated and you need it made simple. She told me to obtain certified copies of the ownership documentation from her office. She told me to contact Declan Foss and have him produce a formal written appraisal, not just the preliminary assessment he had given me by phone. She told me to contact the Carver buyer through his records in the chest and confirm his continued interest before doing anything else. She told me that once I had those 3 things in hand, I would be in a position to make decisions from stability rather than urgency. And if Renata pushes back on the contents, I said. Sybil's voice did not change. The transfer is documented and dated, she said. 18 months before his death. There is nothing to push back on. She is welcome to review the records if she has questions, but the records will answer them the same way they answer yours. A direct transfer with a recording date and a signature is not an opinion. It's a fact. I thanked her and ended the call and sat in the parking lot for a while longer. The March light had shifted while I was on the phone. A thin sun now, the kind that gives warmth without quite committing to it, the way early spring always feels like a possibility rather than a fact. The kind of light my father would have noticed. He paid attention to light. He always talked about how the angle changed the way wood grain appeared, how you could not properly assess a piece of timber in flat light, how you needed the sun to catch it from the side before you understood what you were looking at. I thought about what he had said in the folder, near the end of the practical section. He had written, I know you will wonder why I did not tell you more sooner. I am not going to explain myself fully because some of it I am still ashamed of. But I want you to know that the work in that unit is the most honest thing I have done in the last several years. It is mine. It is clean. And now it is yours. My father had not left me a storage unit. He had left me a position. A set of documented facts that stood on their own, that did not require Renata's acknowledgement or Pelham's reading or anyone else's permission to be true. He had done the work of establishing them while he was still capable of doing it, quietly, separately, with the same patience he brought to a hull plank or a mortise joint or the long bevel of a rib. He had done it the way he did everything worth doing, without announcing it, without asking for recognition, simply making it correct and trusting that the person who needed to find it would find it. The ship's compass from the chest was on my passenger seat. I had brought it with me without quite deciding to. The needle held north. I drove home and made a list. Sybil Crane certified documentation. Declan Foss, formal written appraisal. Carver buyer, confirmation of interest. Orrin Hughes at the restoration yard, who had known about the commission and might know others who would be interested in the work. The naval architect in Scotland, whose name was in the folder and whose correspondence showed years of investment in the cruiser design, who deserved to know that the man he had been working with was gone, and that the work was not. My father had not just left me the work. He had left me the people who understood it. He had done the introductions before he died so that when the time came I would not be walking in cold. I started calling them the next morning. And each time I said my name and explained who my father was, I heard the same thing in the pause before the answer. The small sound of a person who had been told to expect this call and had been waiting to pick up. He had prepared them for me the way he packed the boxes in that storage unit, carefully, specifically, with a patience that outlasted him. He had made sure I would not arrive at any door as a stranger. That was the last thing I understood. Sitting at my kitchen table in the early morning with the ship's compass beside me, and the list of names in front of me, and the March light coming through the east window at the angle that makes everything look like it might be worth something. He had not given me a fight to win. He had given me a foundation to stand on. The rest was up to me. Declan Foss arrived on a Wednesday morning in the third week of March, driving a white pickup with a surveyor's decals on the door, and a set of equipment cases in the bed that he unloaded himself with the efficiency of a man who has done this many times and never found a reason to make it complicated. He was in his late 50s, compact, with hands that had the particular worked quality of someone who has spent decades handling wood and rope and metal in all kinds of weather. He shook my hand at the storage facility entrance and looked at the roll door, and then looked at me. "Your father told me about you," he said. I was beginning to understand that my father had told all of these people about me. That the Sunday calls, the ones where we talked about buildings and grain and the patience required by old things, had been running alongside a separate set of conversations in which my father had been preparing the people in his professional world for the day I would show up at their doors. It was strange to be expected by strangers. It was also, I was discovering exactly the right feeling. Not cold. Not starting from nothing. "He told me you were an architect," Foss said. "Restoration work. He said you understood materials." He was right about that. Foss nodded once, as if this confirmed something he'd already decided. Then he opened the roll door and walked in. He spent 3 hours in that unit. He moved the way Foss moved everywhere, I later learned, with deliberate economy, no gesture wasted, each action connected to the next in a sequence that looked like habit but was actually attention. He measured the hull with a tape measure and a set of flexible battens he'd brought in one of his cases. He checked the fastening at 12 separate points, running a finger along each one and noting the result in a small leather notebook. He examined the ripstock with a hand lens, checking the grain orientation and the moisture content with a pin meter he carried in his vest pocket. He pulled back each of the moving blankets in turn and photographed what was beneath with a camera that was not a phone, an actual camera, the kind that requires you to choose your frame before you press the button. He spent the most time with the molds. He unrolled the hull design drawings that had been in the tube at the back and spread them on the lid of the sea chest, weighting the corners with the hand lens and the pin meter and his notebook to keep them flat. He looked at the lines for a long time. He measured several of the mold sections with his tape and cross-referenced them against the drawings, checking that the physical forms matched what my father had drawn. They did. When he was finished, he stood outside in the thin March sun and looked at his notes. "I will tell you what I'm going to write in the appraisal," he said. "I will tell you first so you can ask questions, and then I will write it up formally and send you the signed report by end of the week." He told me. He began with the tender because it was the simplest case, the most straightforward to assess, and I understood that he was building the appraisal the way a good craftsman builds anything, the simple pieces first, the more complex ones once the foundation is established. The lapstrake tender, the Carver commission, appraised at a figure that was at the upper end of what Hughes had estimated and toward the lower end of what Foss had suggested might be possible when we spoke on the phone. He explained that the figure reflected the 90% completion status, and that a buyer familiar with my father's work would understand what the remaining 10% required and factor it incorrectly. He said the hull was among the clearest examples of my father's technique he had ever assessed. He used the word exemplary twice, and I understood from the way he said it that this was not a word he used often. The molds and design documentation, he said, present a different kind of valuation challenge. You cannot appraise an unbuilt boat the way you appraise a completed one. What you can do is establish the value of the materials already acquired, the value of the design documentation, and the projected value of the completed vessel based on the builder's track record and the quality of the existing work. He had done all three. He named the figures in sequence. The white oak ripstock already cut and stored. The cedar planking blanks in the second stack of boxes, labeled in my father's handwriting with the date they had been acquired and the yard they came from. The teak for the decking in a separate case at the back, wrapped in paper and banded. The bronze hardware. Original patterns cast to my father's specifications by a foundry in Maine that had been working with him for 15 years. Each of these had a value. Together they had a larger value because they were not random materials but a curated collection assembled over years for a specific purpose by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. And the completed cruiser, he said, would command a figure that I am going to express as a range because I cannot predict the market with certainty. He gave me the range. The lower end of the range made me set down the coffee I'd been holding. The upper end was a number I had to repeat to myself twice before I believed I had heard it correctly. This is documented, I said. All of this can be written up and signed and used in any context where ownership or value needs to be established. That's what an appraisal is, Foss said, without inflection. I had been asking for myself as much as for information. I needed to hear him confirm it in plain terms because the numbers he was describing felt too large to trust until someone reliable had said them out loud and attached their professional name to them. He handed me his card, which I already had from our first conversation, but which felt different now, weighted differently, a reference I would be able to hand to other people as evidence that the figures I was describing came from somewhere real. I'll have the report to you Friday, he said. Call me if you have questions about methodology. Don't call me about the numbers. The numbers are what they are. He loaded his equipment back into the truck and drove away down the access road. And I stood in the thin sun with the roll door behind me and the smell of cedar coming through the gap, and I thought about my father packing these boxes. He had known what he was packing. He had known the numbers. He had put the white oak and the teak and the bronze patterns into labeled boxes, and put them in a climate-controlled unit on Route 9 and arranged for them to be mine, and then he had said nothing to anyone who might have complicated that arrangement. He had kept the secret the way he kept records. Carefully. For a long time. The call from Renata came on a Thursday, the day before Foss's report was due, which I later thought was probably not a coincidence. She called in the late morning while I was at my apartment going through the commission records from the chest, organizing them in the order Sybil had recommended, the paper trail that established my clear ownership of everything in that storage unit without ambiguity. She did not begin with pleasantries. Renata had never been a person who used pleasantries unless they were useful to her. And whatever calculation she had been running since the estate reading had apparently arrived at the conclusion that pleasantries were no longer the right instrument. I heard you've been spending time at the storage unit, she said. I've been going through my father's things, I said. Yes. A brief pause of the kind that contains a recalibration. I wanted to talk to you about some of that, she said. There may be equipment in there that belonged to the Chandlery as a business entity rather than to your father personally. The business had creditors when it wound down. Some of the inventory may need to be reviewed in that context. I set down the commission records. This was the move I had been expecting since the estate reading. She did not know about the documentation. She did not know about Sybil Crane or the direct transfer or the chest or what was in it. She was feeling her way in the dark toward the same conclusion she always reached, that there was value somewhere and that value should flow in her direction. But she was doing it without the map my father had drawn. She was improvising against a position she did not know existed. The equipment in the storage unit was transferred to me personally by my father 18 months ago, I said. The transfer is documented and recorded. It predates his death. It has nothing to do with the business's creditors. A longer pause. I wasn't aware of any transfer, she said. He handled it separately, I said. I heard something in the silence that followed. Not anger, not yet. Something more preliminary, The sound of a person who has made certain assumptions and is now receiving information that those assumptions may have been wrong. Renata was not a person who moved quickly into panic. She was a person who gathered information and recalibrated and came back with a different approach. I had been watching her do this my entire adult life, around my father, around the estate, around every situation she encountered that did not immediately resolve in her favor. She was patient in the way of someone who has learned that patience gets results, who has counted on it working so many times that it has become her primary tool. I want to have a conversation about this, she said. With both our attorneys present. I think there may be some things that need to be clarified. I agreed. I said I would have Sybil Crane's office reach out to schedule something. She said that would be fine, and the call ended, and I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment and then called Sybil. Sybil was not surprised. She said this was a predictable move, and that it was actually helpful because it meant any further discussion would happen through the right channels where the documentation could speak for itself. She said she would reach out to whatever attorney Renata was using and arrange a call. She said one other thing before we finished. Your father told me this might happen, she said. Not the specifics but the general shape of it. Someone realizing the value of what was there and trying to establish a claim. He said he wanted the documentation to be thorough enough that there was nothing to argue about. He was very clear on that point. He was clear about most things, I said. Sybil said. That's why this is going to be straightforward. I called Martin Carver the next morning, after Foss's report arrived in my email at 8:15. The report was 42 pages. I read it twice before I picked up the phone. Foss wrote the way he spoke, plain and specific and without hedging that was not warranted. Each figure was supported by comparable sales data, by his own assessment of condition and craftsmanship, by reference to my father's documented history of completed work, and the prices those builds had achieved at sale or transfer. The document was the kind of thing you could put in front of any informed party and say, these are the facts, and have them hold. Martin Carver was a man in his late 60s who had been commissioning wooden boats for 40 years, and who answered his phone on the second ring with the immediate attention of someone who does not miss calls from numbers he doesn't recognize because he has learned that important things often arrive from unexpected directions. I introduced myself. He said my father's name before I finished the sentence, the same way Hughes had, the same way Foss had, the same recognition in the pause. I've been waiting to hear from someone, he said. Sybil Crane told me it might take a few months. I'm glad you called. The commission, I said. The lapstrake tender. I have the contract from the chest. I've had a formal appraisal of the hull in its current state. I want to confirm that you're still interested and to understand your timeline. He was still interested. He had been waiting 2 years and he was not a man who gave up on what he wanted simply because it was taking longer than expected. He said he had been following my father's work for 20 years, and that this commission had been his attempt to own a piece of it. He said if the hull was in the condition Foss's preliminary report had indicated when Sybil had shared the overview with him, he would want to come see it in person before we discuss completion and delivery. You shared the appraisal overview with him, I said to Sybil that afternoon. Your father asked me to keep him informed, she said. He wanted the buyer to know the commission was still active even after the building sold. He didn't want the relationship to go cold. My father had been managing this from 14 months of sickness. He had been calling me every Sunday and talking about brass cleating hardware, and the light off the water while simultaneously maintaining a parallel set of arrangements that were designed to survive him. He had been doing this while his right hand shook and his voice got slower and while Renata changed the locks 2 days after he died. I thought about that for a long time in the days between the Carver call and the meeting with the attorneys. I thought about the 2 versions of my father that I was discovering simultaneously. The version I had always known, the patient man in the shop who taught me to read grain and kept the logbook behind the counter. And this other version, quieter, more strategic, the man who had spent the last years of his life quietly building a structure designed to protect what was mine after he was gone. The 2 versions were not contradictory. They were the same man, operating at different scales of the same patience. The patience he brought to a hull plank was the same patience he brought to a legal document. The care he took with a mortise joint was the same care he took with an ownership transfer. He had just been working on 2 things at once. The boat and the plan. The meeting with the attorneys happened on a Monday 23 days after my father died. We did it by phone because the attorneys were in different cities and because there was, at this stage, no need for anyone to sit in the same room. Renata's attorney was a man named Aldous Breck, who had the measured, careful voice of someone accustomed to operating in contested territory and skilled at making the contestation sound reasonable. He was polite. He was thorough. He had done his research. He began by saying that his client had become aware of a direct property transfer that had occurred in the period before Mr. Vayle's death, and that while his client acknowledged the documentation, she had some questions about the circumstances under which the transfer had been made, specifically whether Mr. Vayle had been fully competent to make such a transfer at the time it was executed given the progression of his illness. I was not on the call. Sybil had advised me to let her handle it, and to sit somewhere quietly and not drive or do anything that required my full attention because she did not know exactly what Breck was going to say, and she wanted me available if she needed to ask me something quickly. I sat in my apartment with a cup of tea, and the ship's compass on the table in front of me. Sybil's voice on the phone, which she had set to speaker so I could hear both sides of the conversation, was the same voice she always used. Level, precise, warm in the way of someone whose warmth is genuine but not weaponized. She told Breck that the transfer had been executed 18 months before Mr. Vayle's death, at a time when he was fully engaged in his professional and personal affairs and had subsequently managed a complex commission, maintained active supplier relationships, and communicated with multiple professional contacts, all of which she could document. She said the transfer had been witnessed and notarized and recorded at the county recorder's office, and that it had been prepared by her office with the standard due diligence applied to any property transfer of this type. She said she had no concerns about Mr. Vayle's competency at the time of execution, and she expected that any challenge on those grounds would be unsuccessful. Breck said his client was not necessarily planning to challenge the transfer, only to ensure that the full picture of the estate had been properly accounted for. Sybil said the full picture of the Chandlery contents was exactly as she had described, that they had been transferred to Mr. Vayle's daughter 18 months prior, that they were not part of the estate, that any further questions about the contents should be directed to her office. There was a pause on Breck's end of the call. He said his client would like to arrange to view the contents of the storage unit as part of her own inventory of the estate's assets. Sybil said she would need to review the legal basis for that request, given that the contents in question had been legally transferred out of the estate 18 months prior. She said she would get back to him by end of week. The call ended. I picked up the ship's compass. The needle held north, the same as always, unmoved by the conversation I had just listened to. She wants to see what's in the unit, I said. I know, Sybil said. Which tells us something useful. What does it tell us? That she doesn't know what's in it. If she knew the value, she wouldn't be asking to look. She'd already have her next move mapped out. She's asking to look because she still thinks it might be old stock and outdated equipment, and she wants to confirm that before she decides how hard to push. I thought about that. She still doesn't know about the appraisal. No, Sybil said. And she doesn't know about the Carver commission or the cruiser design or the material inventory. She knows there was a transfer. She doesn't know what the transfer was worth. Do I have to let her see it? Not unless there's a legal basis for the request, which there isn't in this case. The contents are yours. You decide who accesses them and when. I want to see the appraisal finalized and the Carver visit completed before anyone else goes into that unit, I said. That's reasonable, Sybil said. I'll respond to Breck on that basis. Martin Carver drove up on a Saturday at the end of March with a man he introduced as his son, Thomas, who was perhaps 40 and who had his father's eyes and his father's habit of standing in front of something he was assessing and going very still while he looked at it. They arrived in a truck that was not new but was well maintained, the kind of vehicle a person of substantial means chooses when they are going somewhere that requires practicality rather than display. I opened the storage unit and stood to the side and let them in. Carver moved to the hull without being directed to it, the way a person moves toward something they have been waiting to see. He walked around it twice without speaking. Then he crouched at the bow and looked along the sheer line from that angle, the way you look at a thing you want to see completely. He put his hand on the planking at midships, flat, the full palm, and held it there for a moment. Thomas stood behind him and said nothing. He had brought his own notebook. The fastenings, Carver said. Flush with the surface, I said. My father used silicon bronze ring-shanked. The holes were pre-burred with a stop collar on the bit so everyone went to the same depth. Carver nodded without looking at me. He was still looking at the hull. He stood and walked to the stern and crouched again and looked at the transom. He looked at the way the planks came around to meet it and the way the last plank had been shaped to fit. The bevel worked by hand to a tolerance that a machine would struggle to replicate. Your father did this freehand, he said. He did everything freehand by the end, I said. Templates for the shapes but the final fitting by eye and feel. Thomas made a note in his notebook. They spent 2 hours in the unit. Carver asked about the completion requirements, what remained to be done and in what sequence. I had prepared for this by talking to Orrin Hughes the week before, who had walked me through the remaining work in the specific technical language of someone who had known my father's methods. I answered each question in that language and Carver listened with the attention of a man who is determining whether the person he is talking to knows what they are talking about. Apparently I did, because his questions stopped having a testing quality about halfway through and became simply practical. He asked about the hardware. I showed him the box labeled Carver Commission hardware, which my father had begun accumulating 3 years ago, the bronze cleats and the stainless deck hardware and the winches and the teak trim pieces, all of it sourced and stored in the specific unit that matched the commission specifications. Thomas photographed the contents of the box systematically, each piece front and back. Then Carver turned to look at the moving blankets along the back wall, the ones covering the molds and the cruiser materials. What's under those, he said. A different project, I said. My father's own design. Not a commission. He looked at them for a moment. He did not ask to see them and I did not offer. There was an etiquette to this that both of us understood, the etiquette of a world where certain things are shown and certain things are private and a person of experience knows the difference. On the way out, standing in the parking lot in the thin late March sun, Carver put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the roll door for a moment. How long will it take to finish the tender, he said. I've been talking to someone who can do it, I said. 6 weeks, maybe 8. He needs to see it in person before he commits to a timeline. The someone was a man named Paul Whitmore who ran a wooden boat shop on the coast 40 miles south, and who had been recommended by both Hughes and Foss independently, which in this world constituted a stronger endorsement than any credential. I had spoken to him twice on the phone. He had the same quality that all of the people in my father's network seemed to have, the quality of full attention, of a person who listens because listening is how you understand what the work actually requires. Carver nodded. I'll pay the commission price from the original contract, he said, plus a completion adjustment that reflects current market. Your attorney and I can work out the specifics with Sybil. Want the boat? I've wanted it for 2 years. He shook my hand and he and Thomas got in the truck and they drove away. I stood in the parking lot for a while after they left. The March wind was coming off the water somewhere behind the tree line, carrying the salt smell that meant the bay was close even when you couldn't see it. My father had stood in smells like that his whole working life. The shop had been close enough to the water that on certain days when the wind shifted you could smell the bay inside. I missed him with a sharpness that the busy days had kept at a distance, and standing still in a parking lot with nothing to do but breathe let it come close again. He had built 60 boats. He had kept a logbook behind the counter. He had called me every Sunday for 12 years and talked about grain and light and the patience required by old things. He had poured 30 years into a building and a reputation and a world of relationships that Renata had described as nothing, and none of it, not one piece of it, was nothing. I drove to the Chandlery building that afternoon for the first time since my father died. I had been avoiding it. The building had been sold, Renata had told me so, and what had been sold no longer contained anything of mine, and going to look at a building that was no longer connected to me seemed like a way of extending grief rather than moving through it. But something about the Carver visit, about standing in the storage unit and watching a man who understood what he was looking at put his hand flat on the hull planking, had shifted something. I needed to see it. The dock road was unchanged. The cedar shingles had gone grayer in the years since I had last been there, weathering toward the silver that coastal buildings move toward if nobody paints them regularly, and my father had never painted them because he thought the weathered cedar was more honest than painted wood. The dark green sign was still there. I had thought perhaps the new owners would have taken it down or painted over it, but it hung in the same place in the same color, the letters worn but legible. Vayle's. That was all it said. Just the family name. A chain was across the dock road entrance, which meant the building was empty or between owners or being redeveloped. I did not go past the chain. I stood on the road and looked at the building the way Carver had looked at the hull fully from the outside, trying to see it the way someone who didn't already love it would see it. What I saw was a weathered cedar building on a dock road on the edge of a bay, with a dark green sign and west-facing windows and a shape that said a century of practical purpose rather than the accidents of fashion. It was not pretty in any conventional sense. It was the kind of building that looks like what it is, which is harder to achieve than it sounds. My father had run a business there for 30 years. His father had run one there for 20 before that. 5 decades of work and knowledge and relationship, accumulated in a building that was now behind a chain with a sold notice on the door. I thought about my mother, who had died before the Chandlery entered its final decade, and who had never seen what my father built in the years after her. She had known the early version, the struggling years, the years when the lease was a weight and the suppliers were unreliable, and my father came home some evenings too tired to eat and sat in the kitchen with his hands flat on the table saying nothing. She had known those years and she had stayed through them, and I think what she understood that Renata never learned was that a man building something worth keeping will go through years that look like nothing from the outside. The Chandlery in its final form, my father's reputation in the wooden boat world, the commission from Martin Carver, the 60 documented builds, the cruiser named Eileen, all of it had grown out of those tired kitchen table years. My mother had been present for the roots, even though she never saw the fruit. My father had named the boat after her. I stood at the chain across the dock road and thought about that, about what it meant to name a thing for someone after they could no longer see it. Whether it was grief or gratitude or both at once, folded together the way grief and gratitude always seem to be when you have loved someone for a long time and they are gone. Both, I decided. It was both. I stood there until the afternoon light started going, and then I drove back toward the city. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The letter from Breck's office arrived on a Tuesday, addressed to Sybil. She called me when she received it. It was not a legal challenge, not yet. It was what Sybil described as a letter of inquiry, a formal request for information about the Chandlery contents and the circumstances of the transfer, with language that suggested the possibility of further action depending on what the information revealed. The letter cited the relevant sections of estate law, and raised the question of whether the transfer had been made under circumstances that might affect its validity, specifically whether Mr. Vayle had received independent legal advice at the time. He had, Sybil said. I provided it. I'm his attorney of record on this transaction. That question answers itself. She said she would respond by end of week with a formal letter attaching the relevant documentation, the transfer deed, the notarization, the recording stamp, the date. She said the response would be complete enough that any competent attorney reviewing it would advise their client to pursue a different course of action. What different course of action is she going to try? I said. Sybil paused. My honest assessment, she said, is that once she understands the full value of what was transferred, she will try to negotiate. Not challenge through the courts because the documentation is too clean for that to be a winning strategy. But approach informally, suggest a settlement, imply that a legal challenge might be disruptive even if ultimately unsuccessful, and see if you are the kind of person who pays to make conflict go away. Am I that kind of person? Sybil's tone did not change. I don't think you are, she said. I think you're the kind of person who reads the documentation her father left and calls the right people and doesn't move before the appraisal is complete. You've done everything correctly. You don't need to settle anything. I thought about what she had said about Renata's strategy, the informal approach, the settlement suggestion, the implication of disruption. She had been running that strategy my whole life. The informal conversation that contained a pressure. The patience that looked like warmth but was actually force applied slowly. She had done it with my father and she had done it with the estate, and now she was going to try to do it with the storage unit, and she was going to be surprised when it did not work, because she had spent 9 years learning to read my father's calm as accommodation and she did not know yet that mine was something different. I had grown up watching a man take his time with things because he believed that the right approach was worth the patience it required. I had learned to do the same. Renata had mistaken both of us for people who could be waited out. She did not understand that patience, properly applied, is not a defensive posture. It is the ground you stand on while you build what you're building. My father had understood this in the shop and at the workbench and in the attorney's office where he had gone 4 separate times to make sure the documentation was correct. He had understood it in the Sunday phone calls he made without exception for 12 years, building a relationship with me in the only medium available to 2 people who lived 2 hours apart and were both too busy and too private to visit often. The relationship had been built in 12-minute increments once a week over 12 years, until it was the kind of thing that did not require explanation or defense because it simply existed and had always existed, and the record of it was the record of his voice and mine going back further than either of us could now listen to. That was the relationship Renata had been navigating around for 9 years without ever quite understanding what she was dealing with. She had understood that I existed. She had understood that my father loved me. What she had not understood was the depth of his intent, that a man who keeps a logbook and labels his boxes and makes 4 trips to an attorney to check that everything is correct does not make those choices by accident or in a condition of diminished clarity. He makes them because he has decided what he wants to happen and he is willing to do the patient work of making it happen correctly. She had counted on him being sentimental and disorganized. He was neither. The week Foss's signed appraisal report arrived. The same week Sybil sent her formal response to Breck's letter. I called Paul Whitmore and arranged for him to see the tender the following Saturday. He drove up in a truck older than mine with a tool chest in the bed that was the size of a small bedroom, strapped down and locked. He did not introduce himself at length. He said his name, confirmed mine, looked at the roll door, and said, "Let's see it." He walked into the storage unit without another word and crouched beside the hull, and started running his hands along the planking with the focused, unhurried attention of a man reading something in a language he has spent 40 years learning. He went slowly. He did not rush. He worked his way from the bow to the stern along the port side and then back up along the starboard, checking each fastening individually the way Foss had. But where Foss had been assessing and recording, Whitmore was planning, calculating in some interior space the sequence of steps that would take the hull from 90% to complete. He checked the materials in the boxes labeled for the commission, opening each one carefully and examining the contents without removing anything. He looked at the bronze hardware for a long time. He picked up one of the cleats and turned it over in his hands and set it back in its wrapping with the same care he'd used picking it up. He spent 45 minutes before he spoke again. He asked 2 questions. Both were technical. Both demonstrated that he understood exactly what my father had been doing and exactly what finishing it would require. The first was about the fastening pattern at the transom, whether my father had pre-drilled or planned to drill to fit. I had the answer because it was in the project notes my father had written in the folder, the notes about the commission's construction sequence, and I told him. He nodded. The second was about the seat risers, the internal supports that the thwarts would rest on, whether the stock was cut or still in rough blank form. I showed him the box labeled Seat Components GV Notation 2, which contained the shaped risers already fitted to their final dimensions, the work done, waiting. He looked at them for a moment. "Your father did this over a year ago," he said. "He was planning for someone else to finish it. He knew he was going to be sick," I said. Whitmore nodded again, the single nod of someone absorbing a fact that makes other facts make sense. "I can do this," he said, standing up. 6 weeks from when I start. I'll bring my own tools. You give me a key to the unit and access to the materials boxes, and I'll be here 3 mornings a week until it's done. What will it cost?" He named a figure. It was fair. Hughes had told me it would be fair, and it was. We shook hands. I drove home from that meeting with the appraisal report on the passenger seat and the ship's compass on the dashboard above it, the needle still holding north. I thought about the sequence of things that had happened in the past 3 weeks. Foss's appraisal, the Carver visit and his confirmation at the high end of the commission price, Sybil's formal response to Breck's letter, which I had read and which was 22 pages of documentation that answered every question Renata's attorney had raised, Whitmore agreeing to complete the tender, the naval architect in Scotland, a quiet man named Alastair Mowat, who had written back to my email within a day, and expressed both his condolences and his willingness to continue the collaborative work on the cruiser design with whoever was taking it forward, should that person wish to continue. Should that person wish to continue. I had not yet decided whether I was going to build the cruiser. That decision felt large enough to require more time and more steadiness than I had yet achieved. But I had begun to understand that the decision was mine to make, that nobody was going to make it for me or around me, that my father had structured things carefully enough that I was standing on solid ground regardless of which direction I chose. 2 days later, a Tuesday, Renata called for the second time. She did not begin with the attorney's language this time. She began with something older. "I've been thinking about your father," she said. "About how much he cared about you." I waited. "He talked about you constantly," she said. "You were the thing he was most proud of." She paused. "I know we haven't always had an easy relationship. I know you've had questions about the estate. I think there's room for us to handle this differently. More like family." There was the word. Family. Used the way it was always used, as a tool for softening a position that had not changed, as a way of making compliance feel like warmth rather than capitulation. "I want to be fair to you," she continued. "I know the Chandlery meant a lot to you growing up. Whatever is in that unit, I'm sure some of it has sentimental value. I'm not trying to take anything that was genuinely his and meant to be yours. I just want to make sure we have a full picture of what we're talking about." She didn't know. She still did not know that Foss had spent 3 hours in the unit with a tape measure and a pin meter and a 42-page report. She did not know that Martin Carver had driven up on a Saturday and confirmed his commission at a figure that made her description of outdated equipment look like something said by a person who had never learned to see. She did not know about the white oak and the teak and the bronze and the cruiser named Eileen, or what Alastair Mowat in Scotland thought the design was worth completing. She was calling me with warmth and the word family because she wanted to get into that storage unit before she knew what was in it, and she was skilled enough to understand that warmth was the tool most likely to open a door that legal pressure had not been able to open. "I'm going to keep handling this through our attorneys," I said. "That's the right way to do it." A pause. "You sound like him," she said. "The way you just said that. It's exactly how he used to speak when he'd made up his mind." "I know," I said. And I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time afterward. Outside, the April that had been threatening for weeks finally arrived. A warm rain that came in from the southwest and made the windows run with water and the street below sound like a river. Spring finally committing. The maple outside the window, which had been bare since I arrived home from Morro Bay 3 weeks after the funeral, had put out its first leaves in the past few days, the particular pale yellow-green of a leaf in its first hours, before it has had time to darken. My father would have noticed the color of those leaves. He noticed the color of everything. In the Sunday calls he would describe what he could see from the Chandlery window at different times of year. The winter gray of the bay. The way the spring light hit the shingles before the vegetation leafed out and began to soften the view. He described those things the way he described wood grain, as facts worth attending to, as things that mattered. She was right about one thing. I did sound like him. I had spent 30 years listening to his voice on Sundays and in the shop and in the storage unit where his handwriting was on every box. His patience had come into me the way things come into you when you spend enough time around them, the way the smell of cedar and rope had come into me and stayed. I carried it the way I carried his habit of writing things down, the way I carried his habit of going slowly when something mattered and not moving until I understood what I was looking at. Renata had read his patience as gentleness and gentleness, as yielding and yielding as an opening through which a determined person could eventually move. She had spent 9 years operating on that misreading, and it had worked well enough that she had stopped questioning it. She had not understood that the patience was not about yielding. It was about precision. A man who takes a year to fit a transom plank is not a man who lacks conviction. He is a man who understands that the fit has to be right before you fasten it, and that rushing it means starting over. My father had fastened nothing before he was sure. Not a plank, not a document, not a relationship. He had taken his time with everything, and the things he built had held. I was not going to fight Renata. That was not what this was. My father had not built a legal structure for me to fight with. He had built one for me to stand inside of calmly, while the people who had misread the situation ran out of moves. The appraisal was signed and filed. The commission was confirmed. The attorney's response was in Breck's hands. Whitmore had a key to the storage unit and had already started on the tender. Mowat was available when I was ready for the cruiser. The structure was in place. All that remained was for the people who had called the Chandlery worthless to understand what they had given away. That understanding was coming. I could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. Not with certainty about the hour but with the knowledge that the conditions were right and the only question was when. I picked up the ship's compass from the table. North. Always north. My father had given me his father's compass and a chest full of documentation and 60 boats worth of reputation and 2 pages of his handwriting that said the work in that unit is the most honest thing I have done in the last several years. It is mine. It is clean. And now it is yours. The rain came harder against the windows. The maple leaves outside moved in the wind, pale green and new. I thought about the list I had made the morning after I found the key. Sybil Crane. Declan Foss. Martin Carver. Orrin Hughes. Paul Whitmore. Alasdair Mowat. 6 names that my father had assembled over 3 years of careful deliberate work, each one chosen for what they knew and what they could do, each one brought in with the understanding that eventually I would call them and they would need to know who I was. He had introduced me before he died. That was the gift inside the gift. Not just the hull and the molds and the chest and the documentation, but the network behind them, the web of professional relationships that gave the objects their context and their value and their future. A boat hull without a buyer is a project waiting. A design without a builder is a drawing. A commission without documentation is a story 2 people tell differently. My father had assembled the buyers and the builders and the documentation simultaneously, as a single act, because he understood that the work and its context were inseparable. He had understood this because he had spent 30 years building both at once the boats and the relationships, the inventory and the reputation. The Chandlery had been a building, but it had also been a node. A place where people who cared about the same things converged. When the building sold, the node did not disappear. It moved. It moved into the notebooks and the logbook and the chest and the list of names and eventually into the storage unit on Route 9 where a woman with a ship's compass on her dashboard was assembling a different kind of chandlery from the pieces he had left. Not a building this time. Position. One that did not depend on a lease or a location or anyone's permission to exist. One that was built from documented facts and professional relationships, and the kind of work that speaks for itself when someone who understands it walks into a room and puts their hand flat against the grain. My father had spent his whole life building things that held. This was the last one and it was going to hold too. The chandlery was not worthless. It never had been. And Renata was about to find out exactly what she had handed over when she changed the locks and called it nothing. Breck's response to Sybil's letter arrived on a Thursday morning, and it was different from the first one in a way that told me something had changed on Renata's side. The first letter had been probing, careful, the legal equivalent of a hand testing ice before committing weight. It had raised questions about competency and circumstances, and had implied the possibility of challenge without committing to one. It was the work of an attorney who had been given partial information, and was feeling his way toward a position. The second letter was shorter. It was also more specific. It acknowledged the validity of the transfer documentation. It conceded that the ownership of the chandlery contents was as Sybil had described. And then it raised a new question, the question I had been expecting since the Carver visit, framed in language that was careful and measured and could not quite conceal the urgency underneath it. His client, Breck wrote, had become aware that certain items in the storage unit may have appreciated significantly in value since the time of the transfer, and that the transfer itself, while legally documented, may not have fully reflected the fair market value of the assets at the time of execution. He raised the question of whether the transfer constituted a gift, and if so, whether the value of the gift had been properly accounted for in the context of the overall estate. Sybil called me before I had finished reading it. She knows, Sybil said. How much does she know? Enough to change her approach. Someone has told her there's value in the unit beyond old stock and hardware. I thought about who might have told her. The list of people who knew the contents and their value was not long. Foss was not the kind of man who talked. Hughes was not. Whitmore was not. The most likely source was Martin Carver, or someone connected to Carver, because a commission at the figure he had confirmed would move through the wooden boat world in small ripples, and it was possible that one of those ripples had reached someone who reached Renata. Or she had simply done what she should have done from the beginning. Hired someone who knew the wooden boat market and asked them to assess the contents of a storage unit based on what she knew was in it, which was a half-finished boat hull, a set of molds and a sea chest. Does this change anything legally? I said. No, Sybil said. The gift question is interesting, but it doesn't have teeth in this context. A transfer from a living owner to his adult child, properly documented, properly recorded, is not something the estate can retroactively pull back because the donor's spouse wishes it were otherwise. If your father had wanted the value counted against your share of the estate, he would have said so. He didn't. He made a direct transfer. She paused. What she's doing now is trying to negotiate. She knows the legal challenge won't succeed. She's pivoting to pressure. What kind of pressure? The informal kind, Sybil said. The kind that arrives at your door wearing a reasonable face and suggesting that there's a simpler way to resolve this for everyone if you're willing to share a portion of the value. She's going to frame it as fairness. She might even believe it is. I thought about that word. Fairness. It was a word that could mean many things depending on who was using it and what they were measuring against. Renata's version of fairness, I suspected, was a version where the 9 years she had spent in my father's life entitled her to a portion of the thing he had spent 30 years building, on the grounds that proximity and duration constituted a kind of claim. My father's version of fairness was different. He had written it in 2 pages in a folder in a sea chest in a storage unit. He had written that the work was clean and it was mine. He had not written that it was mine minus a negotiated percentage depending on how hard someone pushed. I thought about the 9 years. I want to be honest about this because I have tried to be honest about everything else. 9 years is not nothing. 9 years of managing the house and the medication schedule, and the logistics of a sick man's life is not nothing. Whatever Renata had calculated and arranged and positioned herself for, she had also been present for the hard years. And the hard years with a sick person are genuinely hard, and presence in those years costs something. I understood that. I was not without sympathy for it. But sympathy and legal ownership are different things, and my father had understood the difference. If he had wanted to account for those 9 years in the Chandlery contents, he could have. He was a careful man. He had gone to Sybil 4 times to make sure the documentation was correct. He could have included a provision. He had not. He had made a direct transfer in my name alone, clearly without qualification, and whatever he had felt about Renata in the 9 years, that transfer was his answer to the question of what he wanted to happen. I was not going to re-argue it on his behalf. I told Sybil to respond to Brecht's letter with the same documentation she had used before, that the transfer was valid, the gift question did not apply, and that we were not interested in informal negotiation. Sybil said she would have it out by end of day. She also said something else before we ended the call. Your father told me something in our last meeting, she said. He had come in for the 4th time about 3 months before he died, and when everything was finished and he was putting his coat on to leave, he stopped at the door and said one thing that was not about the documents. What did he say? He said, she'll figure out the rest. I just need to make sure the foundation is right. And then he said, the foundation is right. I held the phone against my ear for a moment. He was right, I said. He was, Sybil said. That's why this part is going to be short. Whitmore started on the tender the following Monday. He arrived at the storage unit at 7:30 in the morning. Before I got there, his truck already in the lot when I pulled in. The tool chest was open on the tailgate and he was standing at the roll door with a cup of coffee, waiting. He worked 3 mornings a week as he had said. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 7:30 to 11:30, 4 hours each session. He did not work past 11:30 because he had his own shop to run in the afternoons, and he was not a man who tried to do 2 things at the same time and do either of them well. I came on the mornings I could. Not every session. He did not need me there, and he was not the kind of man who wanted company when he was working. But I came when the week allowed it, and I sat on a stack of boxes and watched, and sometimes when he needed a second pair of hands to hold something while he fitted a piece, I helped. Watching Paul Whitmore work was like watching my father work. Not the same movements, not the same habits, but the same quality of attention, the same absence of hurry, the same relationship between a hand and a piece of wood in which the wood is not an obstacle but a material with its own properties that the hand is learning in real time. He worked in silence mostly. He made sounds when he was satisfied, small sounds, a breath or a note that was not quite a word, the sounds a person makes when something has gone the right way. I had not been in the presence of that kind of work since the last time I visited the Chandlery, which had been more years before my father died than I was comfortable counting. I had been busy. I had been in the city with my practice and my building's complications, and the distance was 2 hours, but it might as well have been a different country for how often I bridged it. I had told myself the Sunday calls were enough. They were not. They were good and they were real, but they were not the same as standing in the same physical space as someone who is working with their hands and having the work teach you things about that person that words do not reach. Standing in that storage unit watching Whitmore work, I was getting something back that I had not known I had missed. The smell of wood being shaped. The sound of a hand playing at the beginning of its stroke and at the end. The particular silence that falls when someone is fitting a piece and concentrating. A silence that is not empty but full, the silence of someone paying full attention. I had grown up in that silence and I had been away from it for too long. On the third Friday 3 weeks into the work, he called me over to look at something. He had been fitting the seat risers, the ones my father had shaped a year earlier and stored in the labeled box. He had set the port riser in place and was checking the alignment, and something in how he was looking at it made me put down the notebook I'd been writing in and come to see. He said nothing. He let me look. The riser fit perfectly. Not nearly, not closely. Perfectly. The bearing surface sat flush against the rib below it with no gap visible, and the top face ran level with the precise angle the seat would need. My father had shaped it a year ago, before the tremor got worse, before the sickness narrowed the days, had shaped it to fit a boat he knew he was not going to finish and left it in a labeled box for a man he had never met to set in place. He knew the person finishing it would need to trust the work he'd already done, I said. Whitmore set the riser down carefully and looked at the hull. He knew what he was doing, Whitmore said. Right up to when he stopped. There was something in the way he said it that required a moment to absorb. Not sentimentality. Whitmore was not a sentimental man. It was assessment, the professional recognition of skill and intent. He went back to work. The letter from Renata came by courier on a Wednesday in the 5th week of Whitmore's work on the tender. Not through Breck, not through the attorneys. A physical letter, handwritten, in an envelope addressed to me in Renata's controlled cursive. I opened it at my kitchen table with the ship's compass beside me as it always was by then. An object I had started carrying between the storage unit and my apartment the way people carry things that orient them. The letter was 2 pages. It began not with warmth this time and not with legal language. It began with something I had not expected, which was history. Renata wrote about my father the way someone writes about a person they have actually known. Not performed knowing, but genuinely known in the accumulation of days and small details that make up a life shared with another person. She wrote about the way he took his coffee in the specific drawer where he kept his reading glasses and the fact that he whistled while he worked, a habit I also knew, the low tuneless whistle that meant he was fully absorbed in what he was doing. She wrote that she had loved him. She wrote it plainly and without ornamentation, and I believed it, because it had the quality of a thing said when the defenses are down, not a strategy but a statement. She wrote that she understood the Chandlery contents were legally mine. She wrote that she had been advised that contesting the transfer would not be successful, and that she was not going to pursue it further. She wrote that she was not writing to contest anything. She wrote that she was writing because she wanted me to know that she had not understood what was in the storage unit, and that if she had understood it she might have handled certain things differently after my father died. She did not say she was sorry. She said she had not understood, which is a different thing, smaller but more honest because it does not claim more feeling than the facts support. She wrote that the Chandlery had been something she found difficult, the part of my father's life that she had never been able to enter fully. She wrote that she had understood he was a craftsman but that she had not understood what that meant, had not understood that the work and the reputation and the relationships were all the same thing expressed in different forms, and that when the building sold she had genuinely believed the contents were what they appeared to be from the outside, old equipment, inventory, the residue of a business that had wound down. She wrote a sentence that I read several times before I moved past it. She wrote that she had looked at the Chandlery the way you look at something you have been told has no value, which is to say without really looking. I thought about that sentence for a long time. It was, I realized, the most honest thing she had written in 2 pages, and possibly the most honest thing she had said to me in 9 years of knowing each other. She had looked without looking. She had entered a space and assessed it with an assumption already in place, and the assumption had confirmed itself the way assumptions do when you let them. She had seen rope and hardware and dust and an old sign, and she had thought, nothing. And she had been wrong in a way that could not be undone, and she knew it, and the knowing was in the letter. She wrote that she was going to Florida. She had a sister there. She was going to stay for a while and figure out what came next. I read the letter twice. Then I put it in the sea chest, with the folder and the deed and the appraisal and the commission records and the 2 pages in my father's handwriting. I put it there not to bury it, but because it felt like it belonged with the other documents, the record of how the situation had resolved and by what steps. 50 years from now, if someone opened that chest, they would find the whole story in sequence, the transfer and the appraisal and the commission and the letter, and they would be able to read what had happened and why and how it had ended. My father had kept records because he believed that the way a thing happened mattered as much as what happened. I was keeping his habit. I did not write back to Renata. There was nothing I needed to say that the documentation had not already said more clearly than I could say it. And the things she had written about my father, the coffee and the reading glasses and the whistle, those were hers to keep. They were real things she had known about a real man, and I was not in a position to argue with them and did not want to. She had known him in the daily way that I had not known him in the last 9 years, in the kitchen and medication schedule way, and that knowledge was not nothing. It was just not the same as the Chandlery. It was not the same as the Sunday calls. It was a different part of him, and she had the right to hold it. I called Sybil that afternoon and told her about the letter. That's the end of the legal question, Sybil said. If she's going to Florida, and she's acknowledged the transfer in writing, you're done with that part. Good, I said. What are you going to do with the tender when Whitmore finishes? Deliver it to Carver, I said. Then decide about the cruiser. Sybil paused. Your father would be pleased, she said. The same words, the same tone that she had used once before. I had the feeling she said it rarely and meant it when she did. I think he would, I said. Whitmore finished the tender 6 weeks and 1 day after he started, which was as close to his estimate as made no difference. The completion was not an event. There was no ceremony. He arrived on a Tuesday morning, did 4 hours of work, came out into the parking lot, and told me it was done. I went in and looked. The thing about a completed piece of work is that it does not announce itself. Simply is. The seat risers were fitted and fastened, the hardware installed, the teak trim pieces set and bedded, the whole interior finished to the same standard as the exterior, every surface receiving the same attention whether or not it would be visible to a person sitting in the boat on the water. My father had worked that way. He had told me once that the inside of a hull was where you found out whether someone actually cared about the work or was only concerned with what other people would see. The inside of this hull said that the builder cared. I ran my hand along the seat riser Whitmore had fitted 3 weeks earlier, the one my father had shaped a year before that, the one that had gone in with no gap and a perfect level. Then I walked the length of the boat slowly, the way Carver had walked it, and I looked at everything my father had made and everything Whitmore had completed, and the line between the two was not visible. That was the standard. That was what it meant to finish something correctly. I thanked Whitmore. He shook my hand and loaded his tools and drove away, and that was that, the way things end when they have been handled well. Martin Carver came for the tender on the last Saturday of May. He brought a trailer and Thomas again, and they loaded the hull with the careful deliberateness of people who have done this before and understand that the moment a boat leaves a workshop is a moment that requires attention. Thomas drove. Carver stood with me in the parking lot while the loading was finished. I had put a small card inside the boat, tucked into the thwart box where it would not be visible from the outside. On it I had written my father's name, the commission date, the completion date, and a line from the project notes he had written in the folder. The line said, "A boat is not finished when the work stops. It is finished when it reaches the water." I had not told Carver about the card. He would find it when he launched her. He looked at the roll door. "What's next for the rest of it?" he said. "I'm still deciding about the cruiser," I said. He nodded. He did not press. He was a man who understood that decisions of that weight required time, and that pressing a person toward a decision before they were ready to make it correctly was a poor way to get a good result. "If you need a reference," he said, "for buyers, for a yard, for anyone you need to establish credibility with." He handed me a card. Not his business card. A personal card, just the name and a number. The kind of card a person gives when they mean the offer. "Use this," he said. He got in the truck and they drove away with the tender on the trailer, and I stood in the lot and watched it go and felt something complicated and not quite sad, the feeling you get when a piece of work that has been waiting leaves and takes its waiting with it. The commission was closed. The waiting was over. The work had moved to the person it was made for. I thought about Martin Carver getting the card from the thwart box. I thought about him reading my father's line about the water. I hoped he would launch her in good weather, with the wind right and the light coming off the bay at the angle that makes even the most ordinary day look like it was worth the drive. My father had built her for water. She was going to get it. I drove to the storage unit one more time that afternoon. Not because there was anything I needed to do, but because I wanted to see the space with the tender gone. The unit looked different without it, larger, more open. The molds along the back wall were visible from the entrance now without anything in the foreground, each one numbered and labeled, each one the profile of a specific cross-section of a hull that did not yet exist. I stood in the doorway for a long time. The decision about the cruiser had been forming for weeks in the way decisions form when you do not force them, in the background of other things, assembling itself from pieces. It was not a single moment of clarity but a gradual resolution, like the way a hull takes shape not from one decisive cut, but from 100 small adjustments until suddenly the form is there, and it was always going to be that form and you cannot imagine it having been any other way. I was going to build the Eileen. Not immediately. I was not ready to build it immediately, and I understood the difference between a decision and a timeline. But I was going to build it. I was going to contact Mowat in Scotland and tell him to continue the design work. I was going to find a yard where the work could happen, probably Hughes's yard to the north, where the infrastructure was right and the professional proximity made sense. I was going to learn what I still needed to learn, because my architectural knowledge in my childhood in the Chandlery gave me a foundation but not the full vocabulary of a wooden boat build at this scale. And I was not going to start work I wasn't prepared to finish correctly. I was going to take my time. My father had taken a decade with the design. He had sourced the materials over 3 years and stored them with care. He had built the molds and started the work and not been able to finish it. The boat had been waiting for 14 months in a storage unit on Route 9, and it would wait longer if it needed to because what properly stored does not expire and a design does not go stale, and patience is not the same thing as delay. I pulled the roll door down and locked the padlock and stood in the parking lot in the late May sun. The bay was somewhere behind the tree line, as it always was from this lot, present without being visible. I had grown up with the smell of it in the Chandlery on certain afternoons, and I carried that smell the way I carried the compass and my father's voice on Sundays, as part of what I was, not something I had chosen but something that had come into me over time and stayed. That evening I called Orrin Hughes. I told him the tender had been delivered to Carver. He had heard from Carver already 2 hours before I called, which was how quickly things moved in the small world. He said Carver was pleased. He said pleased in a way that suggested pleased was an understatement. I told him I had decided to build the cruiser. A short silence. "In my yard," he said. It was not a question. "If you'll have me." Another silence, the kind that contains something real being weighed. "When your father started that design," Hughes said, "I told him I'd give him yard space when he was ready. He never called me to say he was ready. I think he knew he wasn't going to get there. He also told me once that you understood materials." "He said that to a lot of people," I said. "He was right about it, though." Hughes paused. "I'll have you. Come up next week and we'll talk about what the build requires and what you know and what you'll need to learn. Then we'll make a plan." We made a plan. Hughes sat across from me in his yard office, a room the size of a large closet with walls covered in photographs of builds going back 40 years, and we went through the design package Mowat had produced and talked about the sequence of operations. He had a notebook open and he wrote things down as we talked, the dates and the lead times and the questions that needed answering before we could commit to a start. He worked through it the way my father had worked through things, methodically, the simple pieces first. He said the keel timber would need to be ordered before the drawing package was complete because the seasoning time was long, and you could not rush it without compromising the result. He had a supplier in Vermont he had worked with for 20 years, a man who kept inventory specifically because the people who called him were the people who understood that the right material in the right condition was worth the wait. Hughes had already called him. He had already described the commission. He had already put in a preliminary inquiry. He had been expecting me to call. I told him what Moet had said about the timeline for the drawing package. He wrote it down. He told me what the yard setup would require and what I would need to learn before the framing began and where the learning gaps were likely to be, not as a criticism but as information, the practical inventory of what stood between the decision and the work. There was more than I had expected. There was less than I had feared. I will teach you what I can, Hughes said. What I can't teach you, I'll tell you who can. There's no mystery in what you don't know yet. There's only work. He looked at the photographs on the walls for a moment. Your father built 7 boats in this yard, he said. 5 of them over there in the South Bay, which is where you'll be. He said it the way you say a thing you have been saving to say when the moment was right. I looked at the South Bay through the window. The light was coming through the west-facing windows at the afternoon angle, the same angle that had lit the Chandlery all those years ago. The same light on different wood. Thank you, I said. He picked up his pen. It was not a quick plan. Hughes estimated 18 months for the build, possibly 24, depending on the design finalization and the material lead times for certain of the bronze fittings, which had to be cast to pattern by the foundry in Maine that had been casting my father's designs for 15 years. Moet in Scotland needed 6 to 8 weeks to finalize the lines and produce the complete drawing package. There would be a period of preparation before framing could begin, the yard space, the setup, the mold installation, the sequence of operations worked out in advance the way my father had worked out the sequence for the tender, so that each step was ready before the previous one completed and nothing was rushed because something downstream was waiting. None of this was going to happen in an afternoon. All of it was going to happen. I want to pause here for a moment because if you have been watching since the beginning, you may have been expecting a different kind of story. You may have been expecting a confrontation, a scene, a moment where the truth arrived in a room full of people, and the ones who were wrong went pale and the one who was right stood steady and said the thing that ended it. That is a real kind of story and it is satisfying in its way. I have felt the pull of it myself in the past few months, the imagined version where I walk into a room with Foss's appraisal in one hand, and the transfer deed in the other, and Renata's face changes when she understands what she gave away. But it is not quite the story my father left me. What he left me was quieter than that and, I think, more durable. He left me a set of facts that did not require a confrontation to be true. He left me a position that existed regardless of whether Renata acknowledged it or challenged it or wrote a 2-page letter about it or went to Florida. The position was the position. The documentation was the documentation. The appraisal was signed. The commission was delivered. The Eileen was going to be built. Renata had called the Chandlery worthless, and then she had called it old stock, and then she had tried the attorneys, and then she had tried warmth and the word family, and then she had written a letter about my father's reading glasses and gone to Florida. Each of these was a different approach to the same problem, which was that she had made a mistake and the mistake was now documented, and there was nothing to do about a documented mistake except understand it and move forward. I did not feel triumph about this. I want to be clear about that, because triumph is a feeling I distrust when it arrives without having been earned by something real, and what I felt in the weeks after Renata's letter was not triumph. It was something calmer. It was the feeling of standing on ground that had been prepared for you, of finding that the foundation was as solid as it had been promised, of understanding that the person who built it had known what he was doing and had done it well. Triumph requires an adversary, and I had spent the past 2 months discovering that the person I was actually in conversation with was not Renata but my father, reading the instructions he had left, following the path he had built, calling the people he had prepared. The outcome, if that was the right word for it, belonged to him. He had been sick and afraid and his hands had been unreliable, and he had done this anyway, all of it. The documentation and the relationships and the design and the 2 pages of handwriting and the key hidden under a shop rag in his father's chest. He had done it because he knew me. He knew I would come to the storage unit. He knew I would find the key. He knew I would call Sybil and Foss and Carver and Hughes and Moet, and that I would stand in a storage unit with the smell of cedar around me and understand what I was looking at. He had trusted all of that. He had built the whole structure on that trust, the way you build a hull on a keel, the whole form following from that one central commitment to the thing that holds. If you have ever been left something by someone who knew you well enough to prepare for you, you understand the particular weight of that. It is not the same as inheriting money or property in the ordinary sense. It is being seen specifically and clearly by someone who is no longer there to be thanked for it. It is the last act of a relationship that had been conducted every Sunday for 12 years, conducted carefully and with full attention, and the last act was the most careful and the most fully attended of all. My father had spent 30 years learning to see what other people missed, the grain in a piece of timber, the fault in a hull line, the repair that would hold versus the one that would fail. He had brought that same attention to the question of what to leave me and how, and the result was in the sea chest and the storage unit and the 42-page appraisal and the Hughes yard in Morro Bay North where the Eileen's keel was about to be laid. He had seen me clearly. He had planned accordingly. That was the thing no one could take back. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. The build on the Eileen began in the second week of September, 17 weeks after the tender left on Carver's trailer. Hughes gave me the south bay of his yard, the one with the best light, the west-facing windows that caught the afternoon sun at the same angle the Chandlery windows had caught it when I was a child. I did not point this out to him. I simply noticed it and added it to the running inventory of things that felt, in the way that only the most deliberate coincidences feel like something other than coincidence. Mowat had finished the drawing package in 8 weeks, close to the lower end of his estimate. The lines were everything the cross-sections had suggested they would be. A deep-keeled offshore cruiser with a sheer that rose gently from midships to the bow and a transom that was wide enough for comfort but not so wide as to be clumsy at sea. When I unrolled the drawings on the lofting floor at Hughes's yard and looked at the full-size lines for the first time, I stood still for a long time the way Carver had stood at the tender. My father had been thinking about this hull for 20 years. It showed. I spent the first month learning. Hughes worked alongside me in the mornings and let me work alone in the afternoons, and at the end of each session I wrote down everything I had learned in a notebook the same size as my father's logbook notebooks, because some habits are worth copying exactly. The notebooks were accumulating on the corner of my drafting table at the yard. A stack of them, each one dated, each one a record of what the day had taught me and what questions remained and what to try differently tomorrow. I learned the lofting floor, the process of transferring the drawings lines to full size on the workshop floor with a batten and a straight edge and the particular trust required by the work, the trust that the measurements are correct and that what looks right in the drawing will look right at scale, and the discovery each time of the small discrepancies that always exist between drawn lines and real ones and how to resolve them without losing the intent of the design. I had done something similar in architecture, the translation from drawing to building, but the scale was different and the material was different and the tools were different and I had to let go of what I already knew well enough to learn what I did not yet know at all. Hughes was patient with that. He had taught people before, and he understood the particular stubbornness of someone who is competent in one discipline learning another, the way you have to consciously set down the first discipline's habits before the second one can come in. He would wait. He would show things twice without comment the way my father had. Shown me things in the chandlery once and then again and then he would let me try. I learned the construction sequence for a keel-stepped mast in a vessel of this type, the specific order of operations that my father had worked out with Mowat and documented in the design notes. I learned from Hughes the particular techniques of the coast, the way the materials and the climate and the traditions of the yard all inflected the work in small ways that were not in any textbook, the things that were passed down person to person in the same small world my father had inhabited. I made mistakes. Hughes corrected them without drama. I made different mistakes. He corrected those too. By the end of the first month I was making fewer of them and beginning to understand the difference between the ones I was making because I didn't know better and the ones I was making because I was trying to move too fast. Moving too fast was the professional habit that needed the most work. In architecture you work against deadlines that are real and non-negotiable, schedules driven by funding and regulation, and the needs of clients who have their own timelines. The wood did not care about any of that. The wood was on its own schedule, the schedule of a material that had been growing for decades before my father bought it, and would last decades after the Eileen was launched if the work was done right. Trying to rush it was not a strategy. It was an error. My father had understood this in 30 years of practice. It was taking me a month to understand it in theory. The boat would teach me the rest. I also called my father's number on a Sunday evening in October. I did it without deciding to. I had been in the yard all day and I was tired in the good way that comes from physical work done well, the kind of tiredness that lives in your hands and your shoulders and not in your mind. I sat in my car in the yard parking lot with the evening coming down over the water, the light going gold over the bay, the same late light that used to come through the chandlery windows and make even the most ordinary inventory look like something worth attending to. I dialed the number I had been dialing for 12 years. I knew it would go to voicemail. I had known it the moment I pressed call. His phone was still active, the number not yet disconnected, and when it rang 4 times and his voice came on, I held the phone against my ear and let it play through. I had heard the recording a dozen times in the months since he died, calling to confirm it was still there, the way you do with things you cannot keep but cannot yet let go of. His voice said he couldn't come to the phone and to leave a message and he'd call back. The voice was the Sunday voice. Patient, a little dry, the voice of a man who preferred talking to leaving messages but was polite enough to record one for people who needed to leave one. The beep sounded. I said what I said most Sundays. That things were going well. That the work was good. That I was learning. I said I had found the key. I said the tender had gone to Carver and that Carver had sent a message through Hughes to say he had launched her off Newport, and she had sailed exactly as the commission specifications described, and that the handling was right. I said the yard was good and Hughes was patient with me on the things I still needed to learn, which were more than I had expected and fewer than I had feared. I said the Eileen was going to be beautiful. I said I missed our Sundays. I set the phone in my lap and watched the last of the light leave the water. A heron worked its way along the near shore, moving with the unhurried patience of something that has been doing this for a long time and sees no reason to change its approach. The evening was cool. The water was flat. I stayed in the car until the light was gone. The Eileen was going to take 18 months to build, maybe 24. She was going to be fitted with everything in those labeled boxes, the white oak I could smell already in the cuts we had made, the teak waiting for the deck, the bronze hardware cast to my father's patterns in Maine. She was going to be built in a yard on the coast by a woman who had grown up learning to read grain in a chandlery that everyone except her father had decided was worthless. She was going to be built slowly, correctly, without rushing. She was going to be built the way my father built everything. And when she was finished, she was going to sail. My name is on the deed to the storage unit on Route 9. My name is on the commission records and the appraisal and the transfer documentation and the file at Sybil Crane's office. My name is in the project notes in my father's folder, written in his block letters in the section where he described who the cruiser was for and why. My name is on the transom of the Eileen. He put it there in the design in Mowat's drawing package, in a note in the margin of the sheet that showed the transom construction details. He had written it in pencil, in his block letters, as a specification. Transom lettering and below it, in smaller letters, and her daughter. I found it when I was going through the drawing package with Hughes, looking at the transom details to understand the construction sequence. I was in the middle of a sentence to Hughes about the carving depth and I stopped. Hughes looked at what I was looking at. He said nothing for a moment. Your father told me he was naming it after your mother, he said. He told me too, I said. In the folder. I just didn't know he'd put my name on it as well. Hughes looked at the drawing for a moment and then he picked up his pen and made a note in the margin about the carving depth, and we went on with the construction sequence because that was the right thing to do, because the work was the right thing to do, and because my father had taught me that the best way to honor a thing is to do it correctly. I have been in the South Bay at Hughes's yard for 4 months now. The keel timber arrived from Vermont in the 3rd week of October, an 8-inch by 12 white oak timber, clear and straight, that Hughes and I and 2 other men from the yard lifted into place and set on the horses and stood back and looked at the way you look at something that has been theoretical and is now real. The timber smelled of fresh-cut wood, the deep sweet smell of white oak that is different from every other wood, and that I had known since childhood. My father had bought this timber. He had specified it and paid for it and stored it and labeled it in a box in the unit. It had been waiting in the climate-controlled unit on Route 9 for 18 months. Since before he died, since before Renata changed the locks and said the chandlery was nothing. It was on the horses now. It was real. The Eileen was going to take another year, maybe more. She was going to take everything my father had left in those labeled boxes and everything I was learning in Hughes's South Bay and everything Mowat had drawn and everything that would need to be figured out along the way that nobody had yet figured out, because that is the nature of any build at this level, The problems that are specific to this hull and this timber and this set of hands and that cannot be resolved until they are encountered. I was not afraid of those problems. My father had built 60 boats and each one had problems that were specific to itself, and he had solved them one at a time methodically without panic, with the patience of a man who understood that a problem encountered is a problem that can be worked. He had spent 30 years building things that held. I had spent a year learning what he had left. Now I was going to build the last one. And when she was finished, when the transom lettering was carved and painted and the hull was launched and the mast was stepped and the sails were set for the first time on the water off Morro Bay, she was going to carry both their names. My mother's on the bow. Mine on the stern. His in the work throughout. That is what a chandlery is, when it is built right and kept right and passed to the right hands. Not a building. Not inventory. Not old stock in a storage unit. It is the accumulated knowledge and care of everyone who put their hands to the work and meant it, passed forward to the next person who means it, generation by generation, in the grain of the wood and the fit of the fastening and the line of a hull that was thought about for 20 years before the first timber was laid. My father meant it. He knew I would too. He was right. Here is what I know now that I did not know when I stood on the porch on Crestwood Lane with a cold casserole and a key that did not fit the lock. I know that the things worth keeping are not always visible from the outside. I know that a man who works quietly and keeps good records and chooses his people carefully can build something that outlasts him in ways that have nothing to do with money, though sometimes money is part of it. I know that patience is not the same as passivity, and that a foundation built with care does not advertise itself until someone tries to move it and finds that it will not move. I know that when someone tells you a thing is worthless, the right response is not argument. The right response is to go and look. I went and looked. The chandlery was not worthless. My father had known that. He had spent 3 years making sure I would know it too. The rest of the work is mine. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.